nice to meet everyone. My first time in the Beyond Extent Discord and community, but as I mentioned earlier, I've been following Beyond Extent for many years. Like when I was a student, the one sheets that used to get put out, I used to have a lot of those in my reference board. Beyond Extent has been around as long as I've been in the industry, so it's really cool to see it kind of flourishing into a larger community now. For people who don't know me or know what I do, I'm Jonjo Hemmens. I'm a senior environment artist at That's No Moon, been there about 2 months now. Before that, I was at Rocksteady Studios for 3.5 years working on the Suicide Squad game. And before that, I was at Creative Assembly for a year on Total War Warhammer 3. In like my free time in personal art type stuff, like to do a big range of environments, props, assets, like anything that I don't have as part of my environment skill set, I like to kind of fill that. So yeah, that's a quick introduction to myself, and I'll get into talking about the scene. So as you can probably imagine, I'm a massive Disco Elysium fan, and this is probably my first like serious fan art project. Disco Elysium kind of affected, the way that I think about the world, and it had a massive influence on me. So now going into fan art, I couldn't think of anything better to kind of start with. When it came to planning out what the project was going to be, I'll get my reference board up. I hopped into the game and took a fly around, and the room that I ended up deciding to work on is pretty much this room here. It's the room that you start the game in. It's kind of like, I'd say it's the closest thing to like a hub for the character, in that like this is where they go to sleep. It's where like most days for the character are going to end. It's a scene that's going to be familiar for everyone who's played the game, and for anyone who sees the art and then wants to play it, they'll recognize what the scene was about. It's also for a bit of like environment artist fan art, it's pretty well scoped. It's a fairly self-contained room, apart from this massive window, which we'll discuss the difficulties and fun of later. But there's plenty of like interesting details. I won't go into spoiler territory, but the character before this point goes on a pretty mad drinking binge for 3 days, and you wake up in the room with it in this state, bottles everywhere, your necktie hanging off the fan, puddles of wine, all of the cassette tape ripped out of the cassette player, just all over the floor. It's just in complete disarray. And something about this environment has so much character and tells you so much about the person that kind of inhabits it. So I wanted to be able to tell this, like give the viewer an impression of what this character was without having to have a character in it. Later down the line, a character did show up anyway, but my intentions going into the project were that I wouldn't have a character. Anyway, I don't think it's worth going into my whip screenshots because they're all kind of on my ArtStation. But the scene kind of progressed like most scenes do. I'll just get my ArtStation up and just go through the videos because people might not have seen those. So unlike a lot of my projects, this was like one of the first I actually took reliable like progress shots on that kind of retained like the camera angle. So I traditionally start off with a fairly detailed block out. I want to get like all of the core metrics in and the majority of assets so I can get like an idea of what the workload is going to be for the next few months. Working from a game that is isometric too posed a pretty big set of challenges in that like you've got an orthographic camera and no like strong way of measuring like what the proportions of things are, so you kind of have to go with some real world stuff like what's the size of a door frame, what's the size of your average man, and then try like figure stuff out. This was a fairly unsuccessful attempt at measuring, but I dubbed it like the Harry measuring method. and it was to just grab his height, do a calculation on what his height might be, and then just stack them up and get some like rough metrics. And it did provide like a pretty decent idea of what the space, like the sizes, were supposed to be, but ultimately a lot of that just ended up getting changed in the blockout because of what felt right, like size wise. Again, like when you're adapting something like this into, you know, a 3D space, like it's never going to line up perfectly, and there are going to be some things that look right from the isometric angle that in first person just feel completely off. So in development, a lot of things did change, like as I went through it. What shall I talk about? So like most of my projects, I kind of like to do a bit of everything. So I like to make my own materials, make my own assets, just be involved in every part of the pipeline. I think my attitude towards like mega scans has loosened up a lot in the past few years, but for the most part, it just is a supportive role now and not like the core, which is kind of what I would recommend. Like the way that everyone treats something like mega scans is to see it as something that supports your production and not like is the bulk of it. I think it's so hard. There's so many things. I don't know what to talk about first. Let's talk about assets. So the scene's got probably too many assets, I would say. I may have gone a little bit overboard with it. My reference board gives you a pretty good idea of like how many assets are like that I've referenced and gone and like picked up stuff for. And there is a bunch of assets in the scene that isn't covered in here, like for the most part, like these the miscellaneous stuff, like your little tables and like your bookshelves and stuff. I don't have a lot of reference for those, just general material reference. I kind of started by taking like screenshots, references from the game's wiki. People have been kind enough to upload all of the like in-game items with like alphas and stuff onto the wiki, so I was able to just quickly grab like the reference from the game just to access it whenever I needed. And surprisingly, it's a pretty decent resolution. Obviously, there's a lot left here to be interpreted about how you would translate something like this into my more realistic style. But that's kind of what this project was about, was to be influenced by some of Disco Elysium's more like painterly styles and see if I could blend it with my own and come up with something that felt like it would be a homage to the game, but also to the game. The first place I decided to look for reference in like texturing and asset creation was Arcane. They've got some incredible materials and assets in the games. You know, Dishonored 2 and Deathloop were kind of good inspiration for like kind of material definition that I wanted to see. So assets like this were just so they just really popped. The use of color and roughness at Arcane on their projects is so creative. They definitely work with their albedo first, then roughness, then normal. Like the normals on most things, especially like an asset like this, is probably the most chill part. It's the albedo is usually where they put like most of their effort, and that's kind of what I wanted to mimic. I think if you're trying to make all of those things particularly like detailed and dense, then you get like quite a noisy asset. But they're able to have really detailed assets that feel quite clean and you know, nice to look at. They don't get overly noisy. So I referred to a lot of their stuff. Look at these Deathloop bottles; they're just incredible. Two good artists to look at are Yannick Gombard and Maxime Gauchot. They've just got some of the nicest asset like renders and work from both of those games. I highly recommend you take the time to go and look at like the stuff that they've done, because it's just gorgeous. Even like down to the cigar models, like you can probably see when you look at this like where I've taken my inspiration from. I do it completely shamelessly. It's great stuff to study. I wanted to make sure that I captured the game's brush strokey style. If I go back to a screenshot of the game, you can kind of see that like a lot of things are washed over with like this kind of like heavy brush stroke look. And to be honest, I don't feel like I nailed the style in the game in the way that I wanted to. I don't feel like I got stylized enough with my work in the end, and could have pushed it further. But I'll run through what my thoughts were going into it regardless, and show you kind of some of the techniques and the decisions that I made throughout. Probably best if I just close the edit for now and I'll boot up Substance Painter, and I can just hop into probably the clock, because that was where like everything started. Yeah, one of the main things that I did was try to inject the brush strokey style in, exaggerate a lot of like the edges of assets, and yeah, push the albedo kind of like you see in Deathloop. Clock. Alright, bear with me a second. The clock was the first big texturing asset I made. This was the one that I tried to use to help define the style, because it had like quite a few materials. It's got like metal, glass, and like some plastics, and I wanted to see if I could figure out all of those materials on one asset to then like extrapolate it out further. This one ended up receiving a lot more attention than some of the assets did, so you'll see some stuff in here that may not have made it to like all of the other assets, but this was the kind of like intent moving forward. I'm just switching to the main texture set, which I don't know if you can see is named very, very nicely. Please don't judge me for my use of fill layer and not renaming layers. I'm horribly messy with this stuff. It's a bad habit, I know. Okay, yeah, it's loading. Yeah, I've got a massive Substance Painter library as well, so that often makes like the startup, getting the libraries to load, takes a while. I did just see a question about textile density, and I think I'll answer that one now. I was very inappropriate with my textile density for this project. When it comes to doing personal art, I used to want to handle texture, like my texture resolution and stuff, a lot more than I do now. I think the art that you create when you're looking for a job and the art that you create once you've got a job is often very different. So as you can see, I think this is like a 4K texture for a clock, which is massively inappropriate for any sort of like game asset. You'll be pretty stretched to find like an environment asset in that actually uses 4K textures in any game. You'll most likely see everything mipped down to 2K, and if it's a large enough asset, it might have more than one texture set, but for the most part, like an asset like this would maybe be on a 1K if it was seen up close, but maybe it'd be 512. For my personal art, I like to work with the largest texture sets because it's fun. You get to push details in there that you don't really get to see. And in the cinematic, you can see as well, the camera does tend to like zoom in on a lot of these assets. We do get the opportunity to see them really close. For some things, I do go lower resolution just for like scene performance and stuff, but only if we don't go like as close as this. But I wouldn't recommend necessarily working in 4K because it's the best looking thing. If you're a student, you should really learn how to use game dev requirements and specifications for your scenes. But I've been in the industry like 5 years now, and I do enough optimization in my day job. When I come to my personal stuff, I like to just have fun with it, really. Anyway, it looks like everything's loaded up now. Whether my smart materials will load is another thing. Hopefully that loads. Anyway, so I'll just dive into some of the materials stuff that I did. As you can see, it's nice and messy. I did at least put some folders in here, which is good. Honestly, this one might just be too heavy to show off nicely. I can just zoom into the asset and kind of like talk about what I've done there. So, as you can see here, we've got quite a lot of like albedo detailing going on. We've got like on the edges, like we've got like some kind of like brushy streaks where it kind of implies scuffing or denting, but without like any noisy roughness or like normal information going on. So we can see some like of the brush stroking texturing going on. I made like, I was writing like a little article about this. It'll probably be easier to show it from, not my Twitter, from this. So where would it be? Yeah, so I'll just make this larger. So I made like in Photoshop this kind of like brush tileable, and once like I apply like a levels to this, yeah, it is why it's important. Tim's right. This is a texture that I pretty much applied to everything in the scene. It's just like I went into Photoshop, created like a 2K image, offset it, and just added like loads of brush strokes using like one of the inbuilt Photoshop brushes. Mainly I was looking at like the walls from this reference, because the walls is probably where you see like most of the brush strokey nature, and like I really liked this thick, heavy brush like contrast that you see. I don't feel like I pushed this enough in like the assets really. It's quite subtle here. I think I was still trying to hold on to my my more realistic style. I definitely struggled to like get into the correct amount of stylization for the project, but it was something that did at the end like help tie things together. You can kind of see it down here, like tiling at a few different scales. So like there's a larger tiler, and then I have like a medium and then a small, and we're tiling at like lots of different scales to help just get it to like pop and break up like each other, so you don't see that like tiling pattern. And yeah, this was used on, I think, yeah, every asset in the scene. I didn't really use it on the metals because well, there aren't too many metals in the scene anyway, and most of the metals are really rough. I think like highly reflective metals just didn't fit with the stylization of the scene, so I strayed away from that and tried to like mute and make stuff like a bit more like dull. A lot of the edge work is done manually too, so like I might start with a generator but then come in and like do it by hand. Like I think the brush that I probably use the most is like the base charcoal. This one, charcoal full frame. Like I use this for everything. And did I use a Wacom stylus? No, I used the brush like my mouse most of the time, because I feel like when you're churning through assets, like you can do it just as quickly, and unless you're aiming for like perfection, I feel like using like the Wacom isn't super necessary. Yeah, I'll move on from this and we can come back to props if people have questions later, unless I've got some other props I can share maybe. Yeah, I can just open up some other files and just show what stylization kind of looks like on other bits, and how rough the metals will look in Painter compared to Unreal, because the metals in Painter, I don't have my like preset scenes set up with like aces and like the Unreal look, because I'm on a different computer than what I worked on. But as you can see, like compared to default Painter preview, like your metals will need to look pretty rough in Painter for what Unreal deems as like a flashy and reflective metal. Like here it's completely muted, not really reflecting anything. But in Engine, it gets a lot more intense. So yeah, some of these assets, like I just blew through them. Like this was towards the end of the project. It's fairly simple. It's using a lot more polys than I'd probably recommend you do. I think like the there are many benefits. If I just open up the file for this one, there are some big benefits of Nanite, but like you don't have to go crazy. Like this is something that could obviously be optimized. Like we don't need to see like these edge loops in here for the low poly, but for the scale of the scene and the amount of assets that I was working on, I did feel like I could just chuck in an asset at like, I don't know how many polys this is using, but more than it kind of needs to. Like we've got little bevels in there, edge loops that I just left because I didn't optimize the low poly. Like I wasn't, like I said earlier, I wasn't too worried about optimization for this one. It's something that once you've proven that you can do it in the industry, I don't feel like I need to prove anymore, and I just want to have fun, and optimization isn't fun. Always. Sometimes it can be fun. But yeah, some of my assets get a lot worse than this. But this is a more appropriate one. Anyway, yeah, when it comes to like the texturing, a lot of it's done in like Photoshop for like these for the text. I was fortunate enough to come across a Reddit post where people were talking about the fonts that the game uses, and I was just able to like find these online, download them, chuck them in my painter, and then usually what I do for it's a process that I started on. I think it was either the fridge or the vending machine. I start making like alphas for pretty much everything. So it'll be my 3D files. Alphas. So yeah. Here's like most of the alphas that I used for the project. Like if there's like a detail on a metal that I know is just going to be like hassle to paint, I'll just make it in Photoshop and then stamp it in Painter. If there is like text on a book, I'll do it in here and then just like again make it an alpha in Painter and stamp it on. This is particularly useful if like you have some like generic stuff, like, you know, min, max, you know, these things could be scattered on multiple assets. There's so many benefits to doing this in Photoshop as well, like just for reuse and for speeding through things. And also it's most likely that you'll need, like, for example, if you've got like an asset that's branded, you'll probably need this text like in a few places on that asset to help like fill up space, or just to kind of like cement like the brand identity in a few places. Good example of that would be, yeah, so with this one, like, yeah, just making these in Photoshop saves you a lot of time. Like one for like the title, one for like this kind of like little subtext thing, which could go like on the side as well as on the top, and then you can use like the title again. And I think that's just, we don't really see it from the back, so I wasn't worried about that. But like, yeah, just two alphas will do the job for this one. Yeah, most of the assets in the scene as well, probably worth mentioning, are bespoke. They're like, some of them have less reuse than what I would like for a game. But when you're making a scene like this, you don't have to worry about like those concerns. You can just focus on making it for what works for the shot. If it were a game, you probably wouldn't want to texture it like this. You'd want to split the kit out more, like have this kind of like one sealed pill packet and then duplicate that across, save yourself resolution. You'd probably mirror these kind of like flat surfaces, onto a surface like that to save on, resolution in your texture sheet. All of those things I'm not doing for this project, so please don't take any of that as something that you should do if you're looking to build a portfolio piece for the games industry. All right, I'll hop back into... I'll just get the scene booting again, and while I do that, I'm going to get Substance Designer open. I think I wrote a piece for Adobe 2 years ago on my forest project where I said that you should keep all of your substance graphs really organized. And I have not followed my own advice on this one. So, sorry, I'm my own biggest hypocrite. I didn't do too much work in Designer for the scene. I kept it pretty minimal. There was only a few materials that I felt like really needed like a bit of love from Substance Designer, and that was like primarily these ceramic floor tiles. In the reference, the floor is a little non-specific. Like in some areas, well, the floor mostly looks like incredibly shiny. Over here, we kind of get the impression that it's white and blue, and over here we get like this incredibly heavy, like specular, like shiny look that kind of blends it into like a gray, and makes you think that this like surface is super reflective, which for like the scene just did not work at all. It looked completely wild to have like the entire floor reflecting up. Like not only was it just ugly to look at in first person, but it really detracted from this kind of like feeling of grunginess and like the dirt that's a room like this would probably have accumulated from not only the damage but just, you know, the years of like decay of running a hostel like this. So I ended up going for just reducing a lot of that kind of like specular. They're still pretty shiny. Like I see them as almost like you would imagine like a clean bathroom tile. Like that would be like the core look for them. That was the level of like roughness I was looking for. So you can kind of see down here like they're still like shiny enough to reflect like, you know, lights and surfaces and stuff. But in some areas like I've made I built into the graph some like dirtier versions of the material. So we've got like a particularly dirty one here, and maybe this one. Yeah, we've got like a semi-dirty one where it's just kind of like dirtying up the edges, and then to go with it, I have like another specular map that's like as dirt, like slightly dirtier, so we get less kind of like reflection when we look at it. And then I would just vertex paint between these. So if I pick like one of my floor tiles here, go to mesh paint, just paint like, I don't know what I'll be painting here. Yeah, we're just painting some like dirt into these tiles here. So this helps kind of like break up like this static single like color of the floor. You lose a lot of the repetition that you'd normally see, and help break up some of those like areas where it's reflective, and it gives you this kind of like more dispersed look when you do like catch a reflection. Like some areas it kind of like blurs out a little bit, some catches it a bit more, you know, strong. But yeah, like I said, the graph is an absolute state. What I started out for this one was instead of generating the tile setup in Designer, which is what you'll see people who do like the, you know, I did it 100% Designer kind of thing. I don't really tend to subscribe to that. I think most people that have used Substance Designer in a production setting will tell you that 100% Designer doesn't really give you the best, you know, look sometimes, and it might take a long time to achieve a result that'd be a lot quicker if you just did it by hand. So I made like this map in Photoshop. It's just like, you know, a tiling texture that has my blue tiles, my white tiles, and like these little like the grout lines kind of built into it, because it was just a lot quicker. I kind of knew what I was looking for, and then from that you can do like a histogram scan, and you can, you know, pick out certain colors. So here I've got like a color to mask, so I just wanted the blue on its own little mask, and great, now we're working specifically with the blue. We can go in and like bevel certain parts, we can keep the grout to itself, we can do like flood fills like you would with any substance built mask, and you save yourself the hassle of trying to figure out how to make this like a nice kind of tile material in Designer, which I'm sure is very easy to do if you're a designer artist, but for someone like me who only really uses it for fun, I'll rarely actually use Designer in production. This is like the easiest way for me to go about it. From there, a lot of it is just like helping develop like the shape of the tiles, and most of the work was probably done, like I mentioned, on the assets, like just into defining the albedo. And this one, it's fairly subtle, just because of how noisy the scene would get if this tileable was really noisy. I tried to kind of keep it more muted, and not like go too crazy with the variation. So you can kind of see on here, like we've got some of the brush stroke details that I mentioned earlier, just gently bleeding in. We've got some light brush strokey scuffing going on some of the tiles to help give the impression of like just some overall wear. We've got like a little bit of like that Substance Designer, everyone has it, slope blur kind of like denting and damaging, just because it helps break those like perfectly straight lines. Like you can kind of see it here on like this tessellated version of it. Like, yeah, it just breaking up those lines is really nice, and on any tileable, I'd recommend doing that if you're doing something like man-made like this. But yeah, it's the material side of things was pretty straightforward. Yeah, here's the bitmap from earlier. Bitmaps take a little while to load because they're a bigger image. Bear with. Actually, maybe this is either. There we go. So yeah, just the tileable, running it through like a the make it patch tile generator and just chucking on some like random direction. And then like when this is like overlaid onto like the tiles, you get this kind of like nice brushy cross hatching effect. Sorry. And yeah, it just helps tie in that kind of definition that we're doing on the assets into the tileables as well. Yeah, okay. While we wait for the stream to come back, I'll just take a look at see if there's any questions that are worth looking at. Okay, Nanite. Did I use Nanite for the scene? I didn't use Nanite for the scene, no. A lot of the assets look like they probably should have used Nanite, but I ended up opting to turn it off, mainly because when I activated Nanite on assets, I didn't actually notice a massive improvement in performance. I looked at the kind of statistics on the scene, and just having Nanite activated like introduced like all of the Nanite overhead of just having that system turned on in the first place, and that for a lot of the assets in the scene, having Nanite enabled wasn't particularly helpful. Like it wasn't doing a lot of work. The assets aren't so high poly that Nanite was really needed. And so just having it on one asset would increase like the cost of the whole scene, so I just decided to not have it in the end. And like you can see, I'm using on some of these high poly assets like vertex painting, which Nanite doesn't play so well with, so it was just easier to go without. It's an incredibly useful production tool, but for some personal work, it might not be super performant for what you're doing, and there are quite a few like limitations with it. How's the stream? Is it back or is it still dead? So if I quickly pan to, yeah, like back here. So the first few iterations of like the wallpaper material, I wasn't really feeling comfortable with like the stylization of it. You can see here I've gone like really heavy, like brushing edges and like adding in like really heavy and like broad brush strokes, but it was difficult to, I think when it comes to stylization, I'm not a stylized artist, so I don't really have a good understanding of like what makes good stylized. I'm very focused on like realistic, so as soon as I tried to pick up something that's stylized, I immediately started second guessing all of my realistic approaches and discovered that I was just making stuff that looked flat. Like for a wallpaper material, I kind of just thought, well, what kind of makes up wallpaper? It's mostly just like a bubbly normal map, and then like nice kind of like roughness that makes it kind of have that shimmer and shine. As like you kind of like move past it, you can kind of catch glints of light off it. I thought both of those things didn't really fit in my head into what like a stylized material should look like. So I just have this flat wall with like brush strokes, and my first attempts were just absolutely horrible. I think even then, like, look, I just whacked some grunge on it to make it dirtier. It just looks horrible. Like, I think my motivation for the scene at this point was really in the gutter. Like, I was not understanding what to be doing with these materials to get them looking, like, nice. And then it hit this point where I kind of started to figure it out a bit more. I stepped back a little bit on, like, some of my attitudes towards the stylization and decided to introduce some stuff that you would see in the real world. I allowed it to have some of that realism. So I found a Megascans material that had, like, I think it's just a wallpaper. Took the normal and the roughness out. I think played with the roughness a little bit in the AO maps and, like, blended them into my material. Then I used decals. I would get it up in editor, but it's probably just easier to show you here, like the impact that they have. So yeah, these it's decal, like brushy decals like this ended up being applied after the fact. I found that when I was trying to apply the brushes into the tiles, not only would you see it repeating constantly, but I didn't have a lot of control over where those details went. So I took pretty much all of the brushstroke details out of the texturing and ended up having, like, what is quite a realistic looking wall material. So if I, like, zoom in here, we can see, like, it's fairly intense. I did, like, exaggerate it, but it's got all of, like, the bumping that you would see on a wallpaper because it's just scans, you know, like normal and roughness map. But it ends up blending in pretty well when you chuck, like, these decals on that do, like, these large brush strokes. It might be hard to find which one. Yeah, I use a lot of decals in the scene as well. Detailing up stuff is a lot of fun, and I highly recommend spamming decals for your personal projects. Maybe not so much for a game, but for personal projects, it's fun to scatter those details around. Yeah, and having the wallpaper and, like, these line impressions allowed me to then do things like tear the wallpaper. So in some places we have, like, the wallpaper kind of peeling off. Like, I went in and hand modeled some, I think this is just, like, a plane on top of the wallpaper. They're so, like, watertight. They're not Z-fighting, but, like, the hovering is just so slightly above that you can't see a seam in 3D. You can kind of get away with doing that sometimes. And same with this. Like, I just cut a seam into, like, what is a flat wall material, and cut, like, a little rectangle out around where this bubbling would be, and then just kind of, like, pulled the edges back using, like, a soft select. So you get some of that, like, wear and tear I would have expected for a room like this. Up here, like, where we've got, like, more tearing, like, this is just, like, decals that I made in Photoshop. I went pretty scrappy with these. I just photo sourced, like, maybe it will be in my alphas folder actually. Yeah, it should be. Torn paper. Yeah, I found these, like, textures for, like, torn paper on Google Images and just used these as, like, alphas basically. I feel like when it comes to this stuff, like, you're being transformative with it. It's not stealing. It's you know, converting it to a completely different format than it's ever really intended to be used for. But, like, some of the tears on this, you can paint this and you can make it yourself, but, like, if you can save yourself the thought process and just, like, get something that looks good and convincing online, save yourself the effort. And then, like, I kind of would turn these into like an alpha. So this was what, like, the opacity channel looked like after I had taken one of these, warped it in Photoshop and, like, made something a bit more usable out. And then, like, the albedo ended up having, like, it was a concrete wall material on, then, like, a little bit of torn paper edging, and you can see this looks awful. This looks so, like, when I zoom in, like, look at this weird edge here. I'm to make sure that, like, the opacity channel has something beneath it. I've just gone over it with, like, a charcoal, like, colored brush, so that, like, we don't really get that, like, harsh white or black line. But it looks really convincing. Like, we're back here, like, you can't really tell that it looks that bad. If stuff's at a distance, you don't need to like worry about it too much. I think a really good example is like I used the same effect on the ceiling here for like this, for the wood planks. This whole ceiling material, by the way, is mega scans that I just brought into Photoshop and like stylized by running it through that brush tiler that I showed earlier, taking some of the planks, adding like different luminance and saturation, like to help like break it up. So when we're looking at it from here, like we get, you know, a really kind of, it's tiling like I think 4 times on this ceiling from here to here, but we don't really notice that very much, and the color blends in a lot better with like some of the woods in the scene now. So yeah, just warping that to my needs was really good. But yeah, like this does not look like convincing torn wood vinyl, but from the perspectives that we're seeing it, which is here, just like these subtle impressions that you can see from like off angles, it's enough. Like it doesn't need to, not everything has to be super specific. When it comes to doing like environments for your folio, both for game and personal art, it's okay if stuff is catered for a shot sometimes, as long as you're not doing a complete bodge job and like it's so specific it only works for that shot. Stuff like this is completely fine and really a lot of people do it. Yeah, I think as I mentioned with the decals earlier, I went pretty specific with them. If you've ever used Lumen, you'll know that it doesn't always give you like a nice AO read. It kind of kills a lot of ambient occlusion through very strong and intense GI. So I even went to have decals. Let's see. I think there's probably going to be some on here. Yeah, I don't know if that reads super well, but I kind of made these like shadowy decals for like certain assets to help reintroduce some AO to them. It's a very cheap trick, and I can confirm that I've used this method in like game development before, because it's nice to be able to cater where some of those shadows go. So like a lot of these, I made like this set of decals here that just would purely just for like little shadow details or bits of darkening where I need them, and the applications of them are so useful. Like I think these underneath like this little these drugs here on the table, can't select the decal for the life of me. If I move it here, you can see it. Like there's a little decal here that's just helping add a bit of like shading. It's not necessary everywhere, it's only really necessary where like the camera's coming across. But those are the little details that just help tie stuff together, especially when like lighting is nuking all your stuff. Back here as well, like on this back wall, you can kind of see there's like this soft shadow. None of that's coming from the lighting, it's just coming from like the decals that you're stacking up. In all of the corners, on like some of like the trim edges here, like just a little bit, you can kind of see it here as well. Like we get that soft shading because I've got like a gradient decal, like this, just a little gradient, and it can be stretched out like crazy and you'll never really see the stretching. And that can just be this was attached, I think, to like every single trim in the scene. Like down here, actually it's pretty intense down here, you kind of see it pretty strong. But when you're at a distance, like it looks good. It helps add to that like stylization, adds depth, and especially with 3D stuff, like it helps break that 3D look. It adds fidelity where you might not normally get it in like with the way that a 3D engine works. So yeah, I'm all for those like hacky things. It's probably yeah, you know, I'll talk about the glass. So I think as well, this is not really a tutorial thing to cover, but more of a word of caution moving forward with things like Unreal. Unreal 5 has been a fairly interesting update to Unreal Engine in that it pretty much broke everything to get a handful of new features working. So in base UE5, like terrain stopped working. A bunch of like features that would work in UE4 just kind of died. We weren't able to use stuff that we had kind of been used to, and Unreal's kind of in a place where new features are being figured out, new pipelines are being figured out. They're not entirely sure what the most optimum rendering for games is going to be, and I kind of ran into this head first on this project, specifically with glass surfaces. So you may or may not have noticed it as I'm flying around, because it's you kind of need to know the scene pretty well to like get a read on it, but like the lighting on the glass here is completely buggered. It didn't used to be broken like this, but it broke at some point when I updated Unreal. And so some of my final renders, I think in my video, I can just quickly load it up here. Let me make sure it's 4K, yeah. So as we pan across here, you can see that the bottles on the right are broken because I took this render after I'd updated, and it took me a while to notice even. But then when we come for the zoom, the lighting's fixed because this was rendered out on a previous update where it hadn't been broken. And essentially what I ended up discovering is that what I was using for this project in terms of translucency was I was using the ray trace translucency, which is a feature that when I updated is no longer... Oh, okay. The stream's broken again, damn it. Thank you for letting me know. I'm just going to end the stream and see if rebooting it fixes it. Thank you for mentioning. Has that fixed it? Yeah, all right, thank you. Okay, great. So I was using ray trace translucency, which I had to read on an Epic blog. I am actually streaming the screen by the screen, by the way, not the apps. Yeah, so the feature of ray trace translucency is being unsupported, and they're only going with Lumen translucency moving forward. And this is something that they've decided on at like 5.3, which is, it's a really odd thing to happen, but like when you're working with Unreal and you're trying to like push the features and go for the high fidelity results, like this stuff will happen to you. Unfortunately, when it happened to me was when I was much too late into the project. Like I couldn't redo all my glass shaders from the ground up. Like I was on my final renders. Just be prepared for stuff like this to happen. When you're working with an engine, it might be in 5.3, but it's still such an experimental thing right now. I highly recommend looking into the forums. If you're running into like issues like this, you kind of need to have your ear to the ground for like the technical fixes and stuff. It's a shame, and it didn't always used to be like this, but the way that Unreal has moved is that it's just more experimental than it used to be. Another issue that I ran into, I was using their new orthographic camera. I don't know if any of you, it's in my demonstration. Let's see if I can find which camera ended up being my orthographic one. Let's see, because it's not is it this one? Yeah. So it might not show up super well on stream, but if yeah, it might. So I don't know if you can tell, but it's really grainy and noisy using the orthographic camera that they set up. Like they reworked for 5.3 like the orthographic camera, and there was a bunch of issues. I think I wrote about it in one of my blogs. Let's see. It's in one of them. I was trying to take renders with the orthographic camera, and I was running into loads of issues with like bad shading. Here we go. You guys can see this, right? There was a bunch of issues with weirdly cast shadows across things, all of this insane grain cutting across the screen, and it caused. There's no documentation about these new features, and you just kind of have to like play with things until you get it right. I think for this one, it was the ray trace translucency on this one that was breaking it. And as for the graininess, it doesn't work with the inbuilt screen. It used to be for Unreal 4 that your screen percentage was always 100%, but now they've built in the NVIDIA like sampling thing where you get more resolution at like half the price or whatever. I forget what it's called. But you have to override this to 100% screen percentage to get this looking like to reduce like the noise in these renders. So yeah, you really have to look in and experiment and know the engine if you want to do stuff like this. It's probably the most annoying part of using Unreal, but once you get familiar with the engine, life becomes a lot easier and you get to do these fun things. So yeah, I'd recommend just building up your literacy with these things during your projects and try push the boat out, and if it doesn't work, go to the forums and see if someone can help answer your question. What other things? Let me just scroll through my documents, see if there's anything worth talking about. I could quickly run through how I did my cinematic. The cinematic was like the passion project of the scene, really. Like I went into it with the intention of like a cinematic where things are moving and it's like animated and dynamic and helps to breathe life into this space. I think showing off this game not only in a different style but from a different perspective that you don't get to see was like the main goal. And with the cinematic, I had the opportunity to guide people through it. And I think as well, for an audience of fans, the cinematic is a lot more approachable than just screenshots. Like it's something that people who aren't into 3D feel a bit more. They get it better. You know, it reads better to them. So with the cinematic, I didn't really have like a great deal of structure. We kind of just start by like opening up and like zooming in, showing some of like the animated details, like the rotating record player. We get the opportunity to kind of like show off who the character is a little bit more. Before just going like guns blazing and showing the character, we get the opportunity to see like the report that he's written. And it's like, this is the field autopsy report that you write in the game talking about like the body that you found, and it kind of goes over some of the details, shows his signature, gives you like that slow tease into the character before we get to show him off. Take the opportunity to show in like some of the assets. These are things that like you pick up in the game, like they're items that fans will recognize and, you know, get a lot of excitement out of seeing. A bit more time to focus on Harry because damn, Gene did just such an insane job with this piece. Yeah, the structure in the middle just gets a bit blurry as we just kind of like go around the scene. I was recommended to do this kind of like dynamic lighting shot. To do this, again, it's just its own little sequence where I have the directional light cued into the sequencer and the intensity and the transform of it kind of just changes. I have like a little material instance setting on this light here to get it to turn on. You can like control that in the sequencer directly if it's like a parameter that you expose. This was probably the most dynamic shot of the whole thing because most of it's just panning and zooming. But this was really nice to kind of, again, my audience for this was less artists and more fans, so I wanted to help them see the dynamic nature of it and not have it be this static thing that's like just super custom made. And yeah, showing it in this example is helps them get over that like 3D nature and make it feel a bit more real. And yeah, I think in this shot we don't see it because the sequence has to be running, but the fan spinning was really easy to set up in Maya. Just a very simple like looping animation of it turning at a consistent speed. And then yeah, just ending on like the wide shot, show the whole thing in its glory. Yeah, pretty simple. I like to do all of my cinematics in their own separate sequences so that I can just kind of like move shots around like this, play with like the length of them and see how they feel. When I know like where they're supposed to be, I can just hop in and make edits and then have it like happen live here. there are some people who try to build the whole cinematic into one sequence, which is just an absolute... It's a nightmare when you've got loads of different cameras going on. This does produce like a lot of clutter in your scene unless you're reusing cameras, but I'm someone who likes to segment things as much as possible if it's my own little thing. Like, I understand how this works. For a production, I would not recommend ever having that attitude, but for your own stuff, like, do it however you want. A lot of this stuff is just done because we want to do it, and it's fun to not like have to work with those rules. It helps with motivation to give yourself a little break on those things. As for the collaboration with Gene, I would love to say that it was like something that we'd planned, but it was just luck, really. That I reached out to him. I think it was for this area here. We've got this little police badge, and I mocked up like his character from. I took his art station, put a white background in, mocked it up as like, hey, am I okay to do this? Or like, are you okay with me referencing your guy? We'd never spoken before previously, and his next message was like, I'll just give you the whole character and you can put him in, which was so, I think, surprising to me that he trusted me with that. But it's probably deciding to reach out to Gene was probably the best decision I made. I mean, the scene, as much as I feel like I did achieve the characterization through the assets, like, nothing quite competes with like this shot in terms of helping feel like the life in this space, and like someone being there is literally having someone there. And moving forward in my scenes, I definitely want to see if I can work with character artists more, because it was so much fun. I highly recommend that if you have the opportunity to, and you can. I mean, we were fortunate in that our styles, the styles that we had chosen for our projects, aligned really nicely. It's rare that you're going to have people doing separate personal projects that line up this conveniently, but if they do, go for it. It can be a really fulfilling experience. Just being able to, I mean, for Gene as well, never had his character, from this personal work in an environment, so we just got to back and forth on like the best setups and the best practices for like how to get his work into the scene, and it teaches you a lot about. It teaches you a different like lens on camera work. I think this is a really good example from this little blog piece that I'm writing. Let's just zoom right in, so you can see here. This was the first shot that I took of the character. He didn't end up giving me feedback on it. I think he was just too smitten at this point and was like, oh, you're doing such a great job getting in and stuff. But it's really flat. There's not a lot of definition on the character. It's not the most flattering angle. And like the field of view is really, it's made for an environment, not for a character. And what I learned is that characters just need like much lower field of view. They need to have a much kind of like tighter FOV on them. And when it comes to like picking the angle, it can just be really difficult. You have to just get your head out of like the environment art camera work that you'll be doing in a project like this. It won't work the same, and it's really interesting to see like the difference in like lens for a shot like this and for this shot, because they're trying to show off completely different things. It was a great opportunity to learn about that kind of stuff. I think I actually saw mentioned hackiness earlier, and this is a great level of hack right here. See these planks? Like, these things are just jammed into the wall. No one's mentioned. No one cares. It's in my static renders and in the cinematic that it's not lining up like at all here. But when it comes to environments, I feel like if you get like, I don't know, 95% or like 90% of the way there on realism, people aren't looking for the problems anymore. Like, they're not worried about all of the areas that aren't done. They're just focused on the bits that are. And if you achieve enough of those smaller details, like the pills down here, like little scattered bits, like where like a pill's been broken apart, or like the cigarette ash under the cigarettes. Like if you just layer up enough of those details, you'll be really surprised at the stuff that people don't catch up on, and like the errors that people just completely miss. Because people, when they're viewing artwork, they often want to have their they want that illusion. They aren't subconscious. They're subconsciously looking for it if they can, be deceived, and believe that this is like a real world in space. And showing off to people who don't do 3D art was the most interesting thing, because a lot of people said it's a very realistic scene when it's probably the most stylized and painterly thing I've ever done, and it's far from being realistic in many ways. I think that's probably, looking at the time, it's probably a good place to stop on the scene stuff. If there are questions about the scene stuff, I'll just go back and show it off, but now might be a good time to jump into some questions.
Thank you so much, Jonjo Hemmens, for your time and sharing this amazing knowledge with us. We also want to thank all of our awesome Patreon supporters for making these workshops and our community a thriving place for learning and growth. If you want to join these artists yourself and are looking to level up your own environment art skills, then head on over to beyondextent.com, where you can find how to become a member of our community, where we offer weekly work reviews, a booklet of tips, portfolio reviews, and much more. All links can be found in the description down below. Stay creative, and I hope to see you there.